We started off this section of A&P talking about the liquid that's flowing through our bodies called blood. We've talked about the pump that circulates it, but we have yet to talk about the piping that sort of circulates that blood or allows for that circulation of blood. So chapter 21 is really that discussion point. Let's begin first by discussing, again, starting off from the heart where we're familiar. We got the ventricles, arteries, all that good stuff going on. And we also have some veins going in. Now, let's do a quick review. We got blood flowing into the heart and blood flowing away from the heart. Blood flowing away from the heart, is it all oxygenated? From the aortic arch, the aorta, from the pulmonary trunk as well, is it all oxygenated blood? No. Remember that the pulmonary trunk has deoxygenated blood that's being sent up to the lungs to be reoxygenated. All you have to know is that blood flowing away from the heart has to be going through arteries. Next question, you probably will already know the answer to this one. Blood flowing to the heart, is it all deoxygenated? No. Remember that the pulmonary veins are bringing back oxygenated blood back to the heart. Just remember that blood flowing towards the heart is traveling via veins, and bloods going away from the heart are traveling via arteries. Now, why we make that distinguishing feature is you're going to notice later on the width of these different vessels. But let's go ahead and break this down, make certain we get it really hunkered down, tightened down this concept of blood flow. Blood flowing away from the heart goes to arteries and then arterioles, which then arrive to capillaries. And the capillaries will feed venules, and then the venules will feed veins, and those veins will eventually wind back up in the heart. How I remember these, or how I remember these types of things and really brings them together, is that the arteries are the squirters. If you've ever worked in a hospital before, if you ever worked in an emergency situation, when somebody has a cut or a boo-boo and it squirts rhythmically, it's because an artery has been cut. The arteries are the things that deal with pressure, so I call them the squirters. Capillaries are the exchangers. This is the place where you actually get nutrient exchange and waste exchange. Veins and venules I call the hoarders because they really hold on to a lot of the blood. They're holding on to at least 60-65% of your blood. Now let's go ahead and take a quick look-see at a cross-section and compare the veins and the venules. You'll notice that both of which have tunica externa, both of them have tunica internus and tunica medius as well. The tunicas externas, you can see that the tunica externa on the artery over here on the left is much thicker than that of the tunica externa here on the vein. You'll also notice that tunica media is very large and has a very unique characteristic to it, but if you compare it to that of the tunica media, it's not much there. And then the tunica interna, it's pretty much the same, but you can see that the tunica interna has to deal with a lot more surface area here because of the tunica media going on. Let's go ahead and cartoonize that a little bit so we can see exactly what type of tissues we got going on a little bit more clearly. There's the tunica interna, the part that's on the inside. You're going to notice that the tunica interna actually makes something called a valve in the blood in the veins. These valves are unique to veins. You'll only see these valves in the veins. But if you go into the tunica media, you're going to also notice that they both have smooth muscle, but the smooth muscle is so much wider and so much thicker than inside the artery because it has to deal with a lot of different stressors and it has to auto-regulate itself. You're also going to notice that these arteries have elastic, dense connective tissue. That elastic tissue is there to help deal with the changes in pressure and reshape and maintain the shape of that artery, kind of like a rubber band. If you pull a rubber band and then release it, it reshapes back into its original form unless you pull it too hard. Same thing with arteries, but we'll get into that later. Then you got the tunica externa, which is a little bit thicker. It has more of a connective tissue to it to hopefully keep everything stable and wedged in there because those arteries really do see a lot of pressure. Let's go ahead and dive in a little bit, just a tiny bit more into arteries and arterioles. Here they are together, the cartoonized and this actually cross-section of the arteries. You're going to see the tunica media again has that smooth muscle. You can see that smooth muscle in there quite nicely. Smooth muscle, remember, isn't striated. It has a single nuclei, and it's something that you don't have control over, but your autonomic nervous system does. You also see, you don't really see it here. You can't see the elastic lamina quite nicely. It's really quite thin. But let's talk a little bit as to what's going on here in the arteries. Remember, it's elastic. It has that smooth muscle. Because it has such a nice amount of smooth muscle, it can really regulate how wide these arteries and arterioles are. We do have two different types of arteries, an elastic artery and a muscular artery. The elastic artery is called the conducting arteries because it really is the first artery type of artery that your body sees after the heart, the blood sees after the heart. It's also the arteries that are seeing the most force applied to them. So they have to be elastic. They have to be strong and pliable, not pliable, but it can rebound nicely. They're very large in diameter. They're very elastic. They got several layers of elastic fibers. They also contain a little less smooth muscle compared to that of the muscular arteries. No surprise there, but also they function as a pressure reservoir. And what I mean by a pressure reservoir is that when the heart contracts, you got the ventricle contracting, it pushes, it's not just pushing straight down the tube. That giant flow also pushes on the sides of the tube. And when it does that, it causes that elastic tissue to expand, just like you're pulling on a rubber band. Now what happens when that bulk flow, that majority of that huge beat passes by, that elastic band or those elastic tissues are going to try and snap back into place. And when it does, it gives it sort of like, if you're trying to get somebody out the door, you can either watch them slowly walk out the door, or you can kick them in the bum and get them out the door a little bit quicker. That elastic artery is sort of kicking that blood in the bum to get it out the door faster. So it gives it that little extra oomph. Going back to the muscular arteries to talk, aka the distributing arteries, these are the arteries that actually, you get further down, they can open and close themselves quite nicely because of that extra muscular tissue. They could be up to 1 centimeter in width to that of 500 micrometers. That's just a fancy way of saying half a millimeter, which if you take a look at a ruler, you can find a millimeter. A millimeter is actually really rather small. Now take that in half. And that's the size of a muscular artery can be, or at least the lumen can be. To get a little bit more perspective, the red blood cell usually is about 8 micrometers in width or in diameter. So fewer elastic fibers, more smooth muscle helps really distribute that blood in different ways that you need it to be. It can constrict itself. That way it can redistribute the blood to places that it need. If you're in a sympathetic response, you're going to send it to the smooth muscles. If you're in a parasympathetic response, you're going to open up some arteries, muscular arteries, that allow more blood into the digestive tract. There are things called anastomosis. Sorry. An anastomosis is the union of like multiple branches. It means that some muscular arteries have branched off and then they come back together in another place. If they do that, it's really quite helpful, because if one blocks off or gets blocked off, you still have another way of getting back to that space. If there aren't any anastomosis, I can't believe I'm flubbing. If there aren't any, then, and it blocks off of that one artery, then you get blocked tissue and you get necrosis, and it ends very poorly. So that is the basics of arteries. Let's talk about capillaries. You got really thin places. This you can notice, and it's really small. You can see there's a red blood cell right there. Remember, that's an 8 micrometer in width blood cell. That's one very small vessel. You'll also notice that it has squamous epithelium. It really allows, these type of cells allow the exchange of nutrients quite easily. Now there are a lot of different ways that these things connect. and a lot of different ways that they interact. Some of these can have a 10 to 5 micrometer diameter. You'll see that red blood cells, again, is only 8 micrometers, and they might have to fold or squish or pinch themselves to get through. Capillary walls, again, that single layer investment membrane really makes those nutrients go on. Now the need, something interesting and neat. Here's the artery, here's the arteriole. What's neat about this is that you do have like 1 or 2 smooth muscles wrapping around these different capillaries at different points that if this stuff doesn't need food or nutrients or get rid of waste products, you can pinch that off so that red blood cells can say, nope, I can't do this. And they just go straight on over to the other side, go into the venule, and recirculate back into the heart, into the system. Or you can redirect it so it actually goes to other places in the body that it's necessary. There are 3 different types of capillaries. There's the continuous capillary, which is mostly found in tissues that need a really tight barrier, like are very selective. So your blood-brain barrier is one that would have a continuous capillary. You would also find it in your lungs and as well as your skin and muscles. You don't really want lungs. It makes sense because there can be some bacteria that might sneak in and you don't want them to have easy access. Same thing with your skin. The capillaries in your skin are nice and tight like this, just in case some bacteria or things like that sneak in. You want them to go a different route rather than your blood and cause sepsis. Fenestrated just means that it's a little bit holier, and so the things can sneak through quite nicely. It's more of a pinocytosis. Where do you find these? Well, that's like the choroid plexus and the ventricles. For your cerebral spinal fluid, you can find it in your kidneys. You can find it in your small intestines, and you can find it in some endocrine glands. The sinusoid one is very, very, very holy. You can find that where places need cells to cross over with ease. You can find that in your spleen. You can find that in your liver. You can find it in the red bone marrow. It just makes sense that it's in the red bone marrow if you want cells to be able to sneak out and sneak back in, especially the new ones. Finally, we're going to end this part of the video discussing veins and venules, just in general terms. You'll notice first, again, that it's a very thin wall in comparison to the arteries, but you also have something continuous with this tunica interna as a valve. Because blood is moving so slow, these capillaries have made blood slow down very, very much, not only because of surface area, but because also its diameters are so super small. So this is like bayou type of situation where it's like floating around. I remember working in somebody's backyard and watching some guy throw some leaves into the bayou, and 45 minutes later the leaves have finally made it down to the next house. So it's really probably not that drastic, but it is very slow. And those valves are there to help move things along and keep blood from flowing back, stop blood from flowing backwards. The venules are the smallest forms of a vein, and they are the stuff that takes up the blood from the capillaries. These venules come together eventually and form veins. Again, as if there was like some type of point that I'm trying to get across, you can see that these veins have valves. Help make certain that blood gets up the leg or up your extremities or up back to the heart. If these valves fail, you start getting varicose veins. Again, that blood distribution, you can see that you can have a good 26% is actually found in everything else besides the veins and venules. 64% of it, the blood reservoirs, the bayous, are holding on to a good 64%. There are other ways to get stuff up back to the heart. And that's your skeletal muscle pump. You got your valves like we've talked about, and your respiratory pump. What these pumps mean is skeletal muscle pump, you contract it, these muscles contract and do their job, but they're also squishing against those blood vessels. And when they do, it sort of acts like a heart, or kind of what the heart would do, and it forces that blood up. When you relax, that blood's going to try and creep back down, but those valves are going to stop it. Your lungs do something very similar. You breathe in, you're moving blood. You breathe out, you're moving blood in these veins. So that is all we're going to discuss in this portion of the lecture. We'll be discussing more about the capillaries here next.